I was 16 when I received the strangest Christmas gift of my life. It came wrapped in green paper with tiny snowmen printed on it, tied with a thin red ribbon. The tag on the front read my name in a familiar, loopy handwriting. My grandmother's handwriting. The problem was, she had passed away the previous summer. The tag was signed with her usual warm holiday greeting, something she wrote on every gift she gave. My parents insisted they had nothing to do with it. They were as puzzled as I was, maybe more so. They said it must have been an old gift she had left behind, something they found and added to the pile without thinking. But that didn't make sense. The paper looked fresh, the ink too crisp to have been written months ago. Inside the package was a small, leather-bound journal. It smelled faintly of lavender, the same scent that always clung to my grandmother's clothes. The first page contained her unmistakable handwriting. It was a note for me, something about how I should write down my thoughts and dreams. Her words felt personal, as if she'd written them knowing I would read them after she was gone. The following pages were blank, at least at first. Over the next few days, I began to notice faint impressions appearing on the pages. At first, I thought they were old notes bleeding through the paper, but the writing was in the same neat, familiar script. It wasn't anything I had written, and neither had she, as far as I could tell. The entries were dated in the future, just a few weeks ahead. The first message was innocuous, predicting I would ace my upcoming history test. I hadn't even studied much, but it happened exactly as described. A few days later, the journal noted I would trip on the icy front steps and scrape my knee. That too happened, no matter how careful I was. The entries became more unsettling as Christmas approached. They detailed events with increasing precision, conversations with friends, moments I hadn't told anyone about. The words felt like they were watching me, recording my life before it even unfolded. On Christmas Eve, I opened the journal to find a new entry. The words chilled me. They described a knock on the door late at night, followed by a visitor I shouldn't trust. It warned me not to open the door under any circumstances. I was so unsettled I couldn't sleep, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. When the knock came, exactly as described, I froze. It was almost midnight, and no one should have been out in the snow. My parents were asleep upstairs, the house deadly quiet except for the sound of someone persistently knocking. My heart raced, but I stayed put. In the morning, I found the journal on my nightstand where I had left it. The warning was gone, replaced with a simple thank you, as if someone or something was pleased I had listened. I never heard the knock again, but the journal continued to write itself for weeks after. Eventually, the pages stopped filling. I keep it locked away now. I haven't opened it in years, but sometimes I wonder if the predictions would start again if I did.
The snow was falling thick and heavy, swallowing the road ahead of me as I gripped the wheel tightly. The radio crackled with static, barely managing to push out a garbled Christmas carol before cutting out entirely. I should have left earlier. The last thing I wanted was to be driving alone on Christmas Eve, in the dead of night, but work had run late, and now here I was, crawling along a winding, desolate road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. The trees pressed close on either side, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky, casting shadows that flickered in the car's headlights. The clock on the dashboard read 11:43 p.m. My family was waiting for me. There'd be laughter, food, warmth. I just needed to get there. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer, a pale, hunched figure on the side of the road, just barely visible through the snowfall. But as I slowed down, squinting to make out the shape, I realized it wasn't moving. It stood unnaturally still, facing the woods, as if listening to something deeper in the dark. I slowed the car almost to a stop, unsure of what to do. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its body draped in something tattered and gray. My headlights seemed to catch its edges wrong, as if it weren't entirely solid, the snow swirling around it in ways that didn't make sense. And then it turned. Its face, if you could call it that, was pale and featureless, save for two hollow, black holes where eyes should have been. It didn't seem to look at me so much as through me, and in that instant, I felt a coldness that reached deeper than the December air. My body locked, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then it raised a hand. A long, bony finger pointed directly at me, and I swear I heard a sound not from the figure, but from somewhere deep inside my own head. A voice, or maybe just a whisper. Words I couldn't understand, but somehow knew I was meant to obey. Go home. The headlights flickered. For a moment, the road was plunged into darkness, and when they blinked back on, the figure was gone. Just like that. The snow fell, the trees swayed, and the road ahead lay empty as if nothing had ever been there. I didn't wait. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning briefly before catching, and the car lurched forward. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see or not see behind me. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my heart was racing, my skin clammy despite the cold. The house was lit up with warm, golden lights, a stark contrast to the bleak darkness I'd just escaped. I stumbled out of the car, barely remembering to lock it behind me, and hurried to the front door. Inside, the laughter and chatter of my family spilled into the entryway. The smell of roasted turkey and pine needles wrapped around me like a blanket, but it did nothing to ease the tightness in my chest. There you are. My mother called from the dining room. We were starting to worry. I forced a smile as I stepped into the room. They were all there, seated around the table, their faces lit with joy and anticipation. But as I sat down, my father's brow furrowed. "You're pale as a ghost," he said, leaning closer. "What happened?" "Yeah," my sister chimed in. "You okay?" I hesitated. The words sat on the edge of my tongue, but they felt too heavy to speak. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I make them understand the way that thing had looked at me, as if it knew me, as if it had been waiting? "It's nothing," I said finally, shaking my head. "Just the drive. The snow was bad." They didn't press further, but I felt their eyes on me as we started the meal. I could barely eat, my appetite lost to the knot of fear still coiled in my stomach. Later that night, as I lay awake in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling, I thought about the figure. About how it had told me to go home. And I couldn't help but wonder if it had meant this home or if it was still out there, waiting for me to return to wherever it truly came from.
So, last night, I had an experience that I can't explain, and honestly, I'm not even sure I want to. I feel like I need to write this down before my brain convinces me it didn't happen. It started with me booking a last-minute ticket on an overnight train. I was traveling to a small town about 6 hours away for work, and driving just wasn't an option. I'd been up all day, and was already half dead from exhaustion. The train was mostly empty when I boarded, which I thought was odd for this time of year. But I wasn't going to complain about having space to stretch out. Things started to feel off almost immediately. The train car was dimly lit, much darker than usual, and the air smelled stale, like a room that hadn't been aired out in years. The few passengers scattered around the car were eerily silent. Most of them just stared straight ahead, their faces pale and slack, as if they were deep in thought, or asleep with their eyes open. I chalked it up to me being tired, but something about them put me on edge. As we started moving, I noticed other strange details. The train didn't have the usual low hum of conversation, or the sound of phones and rustling bags. It was almost unnaturally quiet. When I looked out the window, it felt like the scenery was passing by too quickly, like the train was speeding unnaturally fast. I told myself it was just my imagination and tried to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I noticed the man sitting diagonally across from me. He was staring directly at me, his head tilted slightly to the side. His face was gaunt, his skin so pale it almost looked gray. His eyes didn't seem to blink. I gave him an awkward nod, hoping he'd look away, but he didn't. Instead, he smiled a wide, unnatural smile that stretched across his face, but didn't reach his eyes. I decided to move to another car. As I walked down the aisle, I realized everyone looked like him. Lifeless faces, glassy stares, and that same unnerving smile. I picked up my pace, feeling like I had stepped into some kind of surreal nightmare. When I reached the door to the next car, I turned back briefly and saw all their heads slowly turn to watch me leave. The next car was empty, but the unease followed me. Something about the train felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be here. I debated getting off at the next stop, but then I realized I hadn't seen any stops. We'd been speeding through the night for hours, and there hadn't been a single station. That's when the lights in the car flickered and went out completely. The train screeched loudly, like the sound of metal tearing itself apart. In the flashes of light, I saw those passengers standing in the doorway of the car, staring at me with those grotesque smiles. They were moving toward me, slowly but deliberately. I panicked. Without thinking, I threw open a window and climbed out. The train was moving so fast that the wind nearly tore me off the side, but I didn't care. I couldn't stay in there. I jumped. The impact was brutal. I hit the ground hard, tumbling down an embankment and blacking out for who knows how long. When I came to, the train was gone. There were no tracks, no sign that it had ever been there. Shaking and battered, I made my way to the nearest town, where I ended up at a 24-hour diner. While I waited for a cab to pick me up, I overheard a group of locals talking about some local legend, a night train that disappeared decades ago, full of passengers who were never found. They said it was cursed, doomed to ride the tracks forever. I didn't say anything, but my blood ran cold. I looked it up when I got home, and sure enough, in 1963, a train vanished without a trace on the very route I was taking last night. I haven't slept since. All I can think about is the way those passengers looked at me, and how close I came to being one of them.